The fluorescent hum of the emergency bay was a flatline drone, a sound Avery Thorne had learned to edit from her awareness. Tonight, it was failing. The usual symphony of controlled chaos, the rhythmic beep of a pulse oximeter, the squeak of crepe-soled shoes on linoleum, the low murmur of a doctor dictating notes, was shredded by a discordant arrival. They didn't use an ambulance. A procession of silent, severe black cars had sliced through the ambulance lane, disgorging men in suits that were too sharp, too clean for the city's damp grit. They moved with a chilling economy, forming a perimeter around the man they carried between them. He was the center of their gravity, a vortex of contained violence. Avery watched from behind the safety glass of the triage station, her pen still poised over a patient's chart. The man was bleeding. Not profusely, but with a stubborn, arterial darkness that stained the pristine white of his shirt beneath a tailored jacket. His face was a mask of granite and fury, jaw tight, eyes burning with a fever that had nothing to do with infection. He was Japanese, his features sharp and aristocratic, marred only by a slick of blood at his temple. His hair was a disheveled crown of jet-black silk. He was refusing treatment. More than refusing, he was fighting it. A young resident, Dr. Mills, all fresh-faced confidence and textbook knowledge, had approached with a syringe. The man had moved with a speed that defied his injuries, a blur of motion that ended with Mills stumbling back, a new fear in his eyes, and the syringe skittering across the floor. The man's guards, impassive and dark, closed ranks slightly, their hands never straying far from the jackets that hung just a little too heavily. Hospital security, two paunchy men named Frank and Gary who were more adept at handling lost visitors than organized crime, hovered at a useless distance, their hands resting on their belts with a pantomime of authority. "He's refusing all care," the charge nurse, Brenda, hissed into her phone, her voice tight with panic. "He won't let anyone touch him. Police are on their way, but his people are blocking the entrance to trauma 3-inch." Avery finished her note on the chart. Dehydration, possible gastritis. A world away from the storm brewing 20 feet from her. She watched the man, the patient. He leaned against the gurney they'd forced him onto, his breathing controlled but deep. He was cataloging the room, his gaze sweeping over the staff not as potential help, but as potential threats. He wasn't just a patient. He was a cornered predator assessing the trap. His power was an invisible pressure in the air, bending the normal rules of the ER around him. Doctors hesitated. Nurses averted their eyes. Avery felt a cold, familiar stillness settle in her gut. It was the quiet that came before the storm, a feeling she hadn't experienced since she'd traded one set of sterile environments for another. She capped her pen. The click was unnaturally loud in the bubble of silence that had expanded around her. She saw the way he held his left arm tight to his side, the subtle tension in his shoulder that spoke of a deep wound, probably a puncture. She saw the pallor beneath his skin, the faint sheen of sweat that signaled shock. He was a machine running on pride, but the fuel was running low. The police would arrive, escalate the situation, and someone would get hurt. The federal types would follow. This man radiated the kind of trouble that attracted clean men in clean cars with silent, efficient weapons. She pushed away from the counter, her dark green scrubs a stark contrast to the clinical white and panicked blue around her. She walked towards Trauma 3, her steps measured, deliberate. Brenda saw her, and her eyes widened. "Avery, no. Leave it." The police. But Avery didn't stop. She wasn't walking toward the patient. She was walking toward the problem. And the problem wasn't the wound. It was the man. Her path was blocked before she reached the door to Trauma 3. One of the guards, a man with a face like a stone carving and no discernible neck, stepped into her way. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence was a wall. Avery didn't try to push past him. She met his flat, dark eyes and held up her hands, palms open and empty. A universal sign of peace that, in this context, was also a declaration that she was unarmed. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice calm, pitched just loud enough for him to hear over the rising din. "He needs a pressure dressing and a line for fluids, or he's going to go into shock and die on your watch. Right here." Under these offensively bright lights, the guard's expression didn't flicker. He was a statue. Behind him, she could see the man on the gurney, Kaido, watching her. His gaze was sharp, analytical. He was listening. "He won't let anyone near," a second guard said, his English heavily accented. He was younger, his composure not as deeply set as the first. "He has given his orders. His orders are based on the assumption that everyone here is a threat or an idiot," Avery replied, not taking her eyes off the first man. "I am neither. I am simply the person who can keep him from bleeding out before his real enemies arrive." The mention of real enemies caused a subtle shift in the younger guard's posture. It was a flicker of confirmation. They weren't worried about the hospital staff. They were worried about who might follow them here. Avery pressed the small advantage. "You can stand here and let his pride kill him, or you can let me do my job. Your choice." But the clock is ticking. She held the guard's gaze for 3 long seconds, a silent battle of wills. Then, from the room, a voice cut through the tension, rough and low. A single word in Japanese. The guard stepped aside. It wasn't a retreat, but a transfer of the confrontation. The wall was gone, but now she had to face the storm itself. Avery walked into Trauma 3. The door swung shut behind her, muffling the sounds of the ER and sealing her inside the bubble of quiet menace. The man, Kaido, had pushed himself up to a sitting position on the gurney. The effort cost him. A fresh wave of blood seeped through his shirt, a blooming crimson flower on the white fabric. "You are brave," he said, his voice a low rasp. His English was precise, the structure formal. "Or you are a fool. I'm a nurse," Avery repeated, as if it were the only credential that mattered. She moved to the side of the room, her actions economical as she pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves, the snap against her wrist echoing in the silence. "And you're my patient. That's the only relationship we need to have." He gave a short, humorless laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "I am no one's patient. You are a man with what looks like a deep puncture wound to the upper left quadrant, likely perforating the subcostal muscle, and you've lost at least 1 liter of blood. Your blood pressure is probably dropping, and your heart rate is compensating. In about 20 minutes, that compensation will fail," she said, her tone clinical, reciting the facts as if they belonged to a stranger. "So, for the next 20 minutes, you are my patient." She approached the gurney, not with the hesitant deference of the other staff, but with a focused purpose that was its own kind of authority. He watched her every move, his body coiled like a spring. His right hand rested on his thigh, inches from where a weapon was likely concealed. The standoff was no longer at the door. It was here, across 2 feet of sterile air, between the healer and the man who refused to be healed. Avery ignored his posture of aggression. She moved to the far side of the gurney, placing his wounded body between her and the door, a subtle tactical choice he would surely recognize. It communicated that she wasn't planning a quick escape. She was here to work. She began tearing open sterile packaging, gauze, antiseptic wipes, a roll of pressure bandage. The crinkle of plastic was the only sound. He tracked the flash of her dark green scrubs in the reflection of the polished chrome of an N4 stand. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. His stillness was more unnerving than his earlier outburst. It was the calm of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "You speak with the confidence of someone who has seen worse things than a man bleeding," Kaido observed, his voice still a low growl. "This city is full of worse things," she replied without looking up from her task. She arranged her supplies on a small metal tray, her movements deft and sure. Competence was a language, and she was speaking it fluently. She hoped he was listening. "I need to cut your shirt away from the wound." No, the word was absolute. A command. Avery finally lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. They were dark, almost black, and held a depth of pain that went far beyond the physical. It was the pain of a man whose control was slipping, whose invincibility had been proven false. For a man like him, that was a wound far deeper than any piece of metal could inflict. "I can't treat what I can't see," she said, her voice patient, reasonable. "And you can't afford to let this go untreated. Your men outside know it." "You know it, they will not touch me," he repeated, his jaw clenched. My reasons are my own. Avery understood. In his world, vulnerability was a death sentence. To be seen, to be touched by strangers in a place he did not control, was to be exposed. Anesthesia was surrender. A surgeon's knife was the ultimate violation of trust. And he trusted no one here. She looked at the digital clock on the wall. The big red numbers seemed to mock her. Time was slipping away. The police would be here any second, and then the real threat wouldn't be far behind. She had to break the stalemate. She had to do something that would shatter his world, his rules, his control. She had to take the biggest risk of her life, a risk that could get her killed right here, in this sterile white room. She took a half-step closer, into his personal space, a deliberate intrusion. She leaned in, her movement slow, as if she were about to check the 4-monitor behind him. Her mouth was inches from his ear. The air was thick with the metallic scent of his blood and the cold antiseptic smell of the hospital. She whispered, the words a ghost of a sound, meant only for him. A key to a lock she prayed was still the right one. The winter plum blossoms, even in snow, the reaction was instantaneous and seismic. The tension didn't just break, it evaporated. The coiled spring of his body went slack. Every line of aggression in his face, every ounce of predatory stillness, dissolved into pure, unadulterated shock. His head whipped around to face her, his eyes wide, the pupils blown wide not with pain but with disbelief. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a nurse, not as a woman, but as an impossibility. The granite mask had cracked, and beneath it was a raw, profound confusion. He searched her face, her eyes, looking for the answer to a question he couldn't even form. Who was she? How could she know those words? That phrase wasn't just a code. It was a shibboleth, a piece of deep lore from a world that had no business intersecting with this one. It was a line from a death poem, known only to the highest inner circle of the Kageyamakai. It was a promise of resilience, of loyalty until the very end. And this woman, this stranger in green scrubs, had just spoken it into his ear. Kaido's breath hitched, a small, involuntary sound of shock. He continued to stare at her, his mind racing, trying to reconcile the impossible reality of the situation. The code was a sacred thing, a legacy passed down through blood and oath. For her to know it meant she was either a ghost from his past, a spy of unbelievable skill, or something else entirely, something he couldn't comprehend. He lifted his right hand, not in a threat, but in a gesture that commanded silence and attention. He spoke a sharp, low command in Japanese toward the door. Avery didn't need a translation. The meaning was clear. Leave us. Now. A moment later, the door to Trauma 3 opened and then clicked shut. The heavy presence of his guards vanished from the other side. They were alone. The muffled chaos of the ER seemed a universe away. The silence in the room was now different. It was no longer a tense standoff but a vacuum, waiting to be filled with answers he desperately needed. Who are you? He asked, his voice stripped of its earlier authority, leaving only a raw, urgent curiosity. Avery picked up a pair of trauma shears from her tray. This time, when she moved toward him, he didn't flinch. He watched her hands as she carefully, purposefully, began to cut through the layers of expensive fabric, the suit jacket, the silk shirt. I'm the person who is going to keep you alive, she said, her voice even. The answer was a deflection, but it was also the truth. She worked with quiet efficiency, her focus entirely on the wound. The fabric fell away to reveal the injury. It was clean, a deep stab wound, but it was dangerously close to his spleen. He had been lucky. For now. That is not an answer, he pressed, his gaze fixed on her face. Her expression was unreadable, a professional mask that revealed nothing. But he could see the tension in the set of her jaw, the way her eyes darted to the door for a fraction of a second. She was aware of the clock, just as he was. The only answer that matters right now is that I know that phrase, and because I know it, you know I am not your enemy, Avery said, her fingers probing gently around the edges of the wound. He winced, a sharp intake of breath. And you know that I understand who is coming for you. They won't be in uniform. They won't knock. They will be quiet, and they will be efficient, and they will not care about collateral damage. Her words landed like stones, each one a cold, hard fact.
He knew she was right.
The men who had done this to him were not common street thugs. They were professionals. And the men who would follow, the ones who cleaned up messes like this, were even more dangerous. He had brought a war to this place of healing, and she, inexplicably, seemed to understand its rules. He finally allowed himself to lean back against the gurney, a subtle, yet massive, concession of trust. The alliance was forged in that moment, not with words or promises, but with the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, the snip of her shears, and the shared knowledge of a secret world. "What do you need?" he asked. It was the question of a commander, a man used to deploying assets. Avery met his eyes, her own gaze unwavering. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a strategist. "I need you to trust me. I'm going to stitch the superficial layers here."
No anesthetic.
"It would slow you down. You need to be awake. You need to be ready to move. They will lock this place down in less than an hour." He nodded, a single, sharp gesture of assent. The pain was a secondary concern now. Survival was everything. "They will not look for a nurse," he said, thinking aloud. "They will look for a wounded man and his entourage." "Exactly," she confirmed, threading a suture needle. "So, for the next hour, you're not a boss. You're just my patient. And you're going to do exactly what I say." Her hands were steady as she began the first stitch, the needle piercing his skin with a practiced precision that was both clinical and profoundly intimate. He did not flinch. He just watched her, this impossible woman who had appeared in the middle of his dying and whispered a secret that had saved his life. The rhythmic pull of the suture needle was a strange, meditative counterpoint to the rising tension. Each stitch was a nod of trust, a physical manifestation of their fragile, unspoken pact. Avery worked with a focused intensity that blocked out everything but the task at hand, closing the wound, stopping the bleeding, buying them time. Kaido remained unnervingly still, his breathing evening out into a controlled cadence. He was processing the pain, compartmentalizing it, a skill learned through a life where showing weakness was a fatal error. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of thread through skin and the distant, approaching wail of sirens. The police were arriving. The first layer of incompetent authority. "They will ask questions," Kaido said, his voice low. "Your name will be on a report." "My name is on a lot of reports," Avery replied, her tone dry. She tied off a knot with a surgeon's precision. "This one will be the least interesting," he almost smiled. It was a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, but it was there. "You have done this before." "Not stitching."
This.
The quiet preparation for a storm, it wasn't a question. It was an observation. Avery paused, her hands hovering over his side for a fraction of a second. "I prefer a quiet life," she said, the words carefully chosen. Sometimes, life doesn't cooperate. Before he could press further, the doors to the main ER burst open. The sound was different from before, less panicked, more official. It was the clatter of heavy boots, the squawk of radios. Voices were raised. Avery didn't need to see them to know what was happening. The local police were trying to assert control over a situation they didn't understand, pushing against the unmovable wall of Kaido's men. It was a prelude. The main event was yet to come. And then they arrived.
2 men.
They didn't wear uniforms. They wore identical, nondescript gray suits that were perfectly tailored and utterly forgettable. They moved through the chaos of the ER with a preternatural calm, their presence parting the sea of panicked nurses and confused cops like sharks gliding through a school of fish. One was talking quietly into his cufflink, the other held a slim tablet. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't brandish weapons. They radiated an aura of absolute, unimpeachable authority that made the uniformed officers look like amateurs. Avery saw them through the small window in the trauma room door. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, washed over her. She recognized the type. They weren't feds in the traditional sense. They were cleaners. The kind of men who operated in the spaces between jurisdictions, erasing problems with quiet, lethal efficiency. One of them looked up, and his eyes, pale and empty as a winter sky, met hers through the glass. There was no recognition, just a flat, dismissive assessment. She was part of the scenery. A nurse. Insignificant. It was a fatal miscalculation on his part, and it was their only advantage. "They're here," she said softly, not taking her eyes off the men. Kaido tried to sit up, his hand instinctively going to his side. Avery put a firm hand on his shoulder.
No, not yet.
"Stay down. You're a patient in critical condition. You are barely conscious. Understand?" He understood immediately. He slumped back onto the gurney, his eyes fluttering closed, his breathing becoming shallow. He was an actor, and the role was second nature to him. The door opened without a knock. The man with the pale eyes stepped inside, his partner standing guard at the threshold. He exuded a scent of expensive cologne and cold purpose. He smiled, a thin, bloodless gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "Apologies for the intrusion," he said, his voice smooth and professional. He held up a badge that identified him as a member of a task force so obscure it was probably invented that morning. "We're taking custody of the patient." National security matter. The hospital administrator, a harried man named Peterson, scurried in behind him, wringing his hands. "This is highly irregular, it is," the agent agreed pleasantly. "These are irregular times. He will be transferred to a secure federal medical facility immediately. Please have your staff stand down." Avery stepped forward, placing herself between the agent and Kaido. "He's not stable enough to be moved. He has a penetrating abdominal wound. Moving him could cause a fatal hemorrhage." The agent's pale eyes settled on her. The feigned pleasantness evaporated, replaced by a chilling emptiness. "And you are?" "Avery Thorne. I'm his attending nurse," she said, her voice firm, her posture radiating a professional defiance she did not feel. "His pressure is unstable. He needs to be monitored." The agent glanced at Kaido's still form, then back at her. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He was a man accustomed to immediate compliance. "Your concern for your patient is noted, Nurse Thorne. It is also irrelevant. He is leaving." Now, the countdown had just hit 0. It was time to go. "Of course," Avery said, her voice shifting from defiant to compliant in a heartbeat. The sudden change caught the agent off guard. "We'll need to prep him for transfer. I'll need a portable monitor and a transfusion bag. His pressure is still dangerously low." "It will take me 5 minutes." She was banking on his arrogance, on his assumption that she was just a procedural obstacle he had to manage. The agent's eyes narrowed slightly, but he saw the logic. A dead asset was of no use to him. A live one, even one being tended to by a meddlesome nurse, was preferable. "You have 3 minutes," he said, his tone final. He turned to the administrator. "Clear this hallway. No one in or out." As the agent stepped out to enforce his order, Avery turned back to Kaido. Her movements were a blur of controlled urgency. She wasn't grabbing a portable monitor. She was grabbing a spare 4-pole, its metal base heavy and solid. She ripped a privacy curtain from its track, the screech of the hooks a jarring sound in the tense quiet. "Can you walk?" she asked in a low voice. Kaido's eyes opened. They were clear and sharp. The act was over. "If I have to, you have to," she said. She quickly wrapped a blood pressure cuff around his arm, not to check his pressure, but to secure his wounded arm to his side, creating a makeshift sling. "The morgue. It's in the sublevel. There's a service elevator at the end of the west corridor, behind the laundry depot. It's the only way down that isn't monitored by main security cameras." He looked at her, a question in his eyes. How could she possibly know that? "I've worked the night shift for 3 years, she said, answering the unasked question. "You learn the building's secrets. You learn all the ways out." She handed him the heavy 4-pole. "You're going to use this as a crutch. Stay on my 6. Don't make a sound." She moved to the back of the trauma room where a small, secondary door, meant for stocking supplies, led directly into a narrow service corridor.
It was a long shot.
It was their only shot. "They'll expect us to go up, towards a roof," she whispered, her hand on the door handle. "Or out through the front, creating a scene. They won't expect us to go down." Into the cold, Kaido pushed himself off the gurney, his feet hitting the linoleum floor with a soft thud. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he swayed, his face paling. He gripped the four-pole, his knuckles white. The pain was a living thing inside him, but his will was stronger. He straightened, his eyes locking with hers. "Lead the way, Nurse Thorne," he breathed, his voice tight with effort. Avery took a deep breath, held it, and pushed the door open. The service corridor was dark, smelling of dust and disinfectant. It was a narrow artery within the hospital's walls, unseen and forgotten. She slipped through the opening, Kaido right behind her. She let the door click softly shut just as she heard the agent's voice from the main hallway, sharp and impatient. 2 minutes, nurse." The chase had begun. They were ghosts in the machine, moving through the hospital's hidden skeleton, with the hunters just a wall away. The plan was insane. It was desperate. And it was all they had. The service corridor was a tight, dim passage, a world away from the brightly lit hospital. Exposed pipes and wiring ran along the ceiling like metallic veins. The only light came from the red glow of emergency exit signs spaced far apart, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed with their movement. The air was cool and still. Every sound was amplified. The soft squeak of Avery's rubber-soled shoes, the faint metallic scrape of the four-pole against the concrete floor, the ragged edge of Kaido's breathing. They moved quickly, a silent, two-person procession. Avery led, her senses on high alert. She knew these corridors, had used them to bypass crowded hallways on busy nights, but she had never navigated them with the feeling of a predator at her back. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of silence. Kaido followed a step behind. He was leaning heavily on the pole, but he moved with a grim determination. Each step was a visible effort of will over pain. He didn't complain, didn't slow her down. He had ceded command, placing his survival entirely in her hands, and his focus was absolute. He watched her, trusted her instincts, his own formidable skills useless in this alien environment. They reached a junction. To the left, the corridor continued towards the main building. To the right, it sloped down into a darker, narrower tunnel that led to the older wing of the hospital, where the laundry facilities were housed. Avery didn't hesitate. She went right. The air grew warmer, thick with the smell of industrial soap and hot steam. The rhythmic, thumping heartbeat of the giant washing machines grew louder, a welcome cover for any noise they might make. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the corridor behind them. It was sharp, clear, and close. Too close. "Check the service access points." All of them. The agent. They had realized the deception far faster than she had anticipated. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the base of her skull. She pushed it down. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She grabbed Kaido's arm, pulling him towards a heavy metal door marked linen chute. Authorized personnel only. "In here," she hissed. "What is it?" he asked, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. A shortcut. She wrenched the heavy door open. Inside was a small, dark closet, dominated by the wide, stainless steel maw of the laundry chute. It was a straight drop, 3 floors down to the collection bins in the basement. It was insane. It was perfect. "They won't expect this," she said, more to herself than to him. "It's too stupid." Footsteps were pounding down the corridor now, getting closer. Heavy, purposeful strides. They had seconds. "You first," she said, pointing to the chute. Kaido looked from her to the dark opening and back again. There was no hesitation in his eyes, only a flicker of something else. Dark humor, perhaps. Or respect. "You are full of surprises." Nurse Thorne, he handed her the four-pole, then swung his legs into the chute, his body disappearing into the darkness with a faint whoosh of air and a muffled thud far below. Avery listened for the footsteps. They were almost at the junction. She peered around the edge of the doorframe. She saw a flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. She threw the four-pole down the opposite corridor. It clattered against the concrete floor, a loud, ringing crash of metal that echoed through the tunnel. "There," a voice shouted. The footsteps immediately changed direction, pounding away from them, towards the sound. It had bought them a few precious moments. Avery didn't waste them. She scrambled into the chute, gripping the sides and letting herself fall into the darkness. The drop was disorienting, a brief, terrifying sensation of weightlessness before she landed in a mountain of soft, still warm hospital sheets. The landing knocked the wind out of her, but the linens cushioned the impact. For a moment, she lay there, tangled in white cotton, the smell of bleach and clean sweat filling her senses. Kaido was already on his feet, his hand extended to help her up. His face was grim in the dim light of the basement. "Impressive," he murmured, pulling her to her feet. "Though I believe my stitches may have shifted." A small, dark stain was beginning to spread on the bandage she had applied. There was no time to fix it. The reprieve was over. A new sound reached them, the groan of the service elevator from the floor above them. They were coming down. The basement was a labyrinth of concrete pillars and caged storage units. The air was damp and cold, a stark contrast to the steamy heat of the laundry room. A single, flickering fluorescent bulb cast a sickly yellow light over their immediate surroundings, leaving the rest of the vast space in deep shadow. The elevator groaned again, closer this time, its descent a clear and present threat. They couldn't stay here. "This way," Avery whispered, her voice tight. She pulled him toward the deeper shadows, away from the elevator bank. Her mind was a map of the hospital's underbelly. She knew the layout, the flow of pipes, the location of the emergency generator, the path to the morgue's loading bay. They moved through the darkness, their hands occasionally brushing against the cold, damp concrete of the support pillars. The intimacy of their shared flight was a strange, charged thing. They were two separate worlds colliding in this desperate race for survival, bound by a secret code and the threat of imminent death. Kaido was flagging. The initial adrenaline was wearing off, and blood loss and pain were taking their toll. His steps became less steady, his breathing more labored. He stumbled, catching himself against a wire cage filled with old medical records, the metal rattling loudly in the silence. Avery froze, her hand flying to his chest, both to steady him and to feel the frantic beat of his heart. His skin was cold and clammy through the thin fabric of his ruined shirt. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice a low, urgent murmur against his ear. Just a little further, he looked down at her hand on his chest, then up at her face. In the dim light, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, but beneath it, there was a core of unyielding steel. He nodded, pushing himself upright. "I am with you." The elevator chimed its arrival on their level. The sound was deafening. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, spilling clean, white light into the grimy basement. Two silhouettes, dark and sharp-edged, stepped out. They didn't speak. They fanned out, moving with a practiced, predatory grace, their flashlight beams cutting methodical swaths through the darkness. Avery pulled Kaido behind a massive, humming boiler unit. The heat from the machine washed over them, a comforting warmth in the subterranean chill. They were pressed together in the narrow space, the solid metal of the boiler at their backs, the darkness their only shield. She could feel the slight tremor running through his body, a combination of shock and exertion. He was so close she could feel the warmth of his breath on her neck. Her own breathing was shallow, her senses straining, listening for the soft tread of the agent's shoes on the concrete. One of the flashlight beams swept past their hiding spot, the light glinting off a nearby pipe before moving on. Avery held her breath. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity. This was the tipping point, survival or failure, all balanced on this single, fragile moment of concealment. The footsteps drew closer. Avery's hand, still resting on Kaido's chest, tightened. It was no longer a clinical touch, but an anchor, a point of connection in the terrifying darkness. She felt his hand cover hers, his grip surprisingly strong. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was an acknowledgement, a silent communication of shared fate. We live or die here together. The footsteps stopped just on the other side of the boiler. Avery's blood ran cold. She could hear the faint rustle of clothing. One of the agents was right there, mere feet away. She closed her eyes, preparing for the inevitable discovery, the blinding light, the final, quiet sound. Then, a radio crackled to life, breaking the spell. Sublevel is clear. They're not here. Check the loading docks. The agent on the other side of the boiler spoke into his own radio. Copy that. Proceeding to exterior perimeter, the footsteps receded. The elevator doors hissed shut, and the groan of its ascent faded into silence. They were alone again. Avery let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It shuddered out of her, trembling with relief. They had escaped.
For now.
The narrow escape had cost Kaido what little strength he had left. When Avery moved to step away, he sagged against her, his weight a dead thing. His head dropped to her shoulder, his face buried in the curve of her neck. His survival now rested completely on her. The moment hung in the air, thick with the scent of ozone from the boiler and the metallic tang of Kaido's blood. His surrender was total, a transfer of weight and will that was more intimate than any touch they had shared. For a long moment, Avery simply stood there, absorbing the shock of it, the solid, heavy reality of this dangerous man leaning on her, completely dependent. She was no longer just his guide. She was his lifeline. She shifted her weight, wrapping her arm more securely around his waist to support him. "Come on," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion. The loading bay is just past these generators. She half led, half dragged him through the final stretch of the basement. They emerged from the dark maze into the stark, sterile environment of the morgue's receiving area. The air was frigid, sanitized, and unnervingly still. Rows of gleaming stainless steel tables stood empty under harsh, white lights. It was a place of endings, but for them, it had to be a beginning. The large, rolling metal door of the loading bay was at the far end of the room. A small, regular-sized door was cut into it, leading out into the night. Rain lashed against the glass panel in the door, distorting the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars still clustered at the hospital's main entrance. The storm outside mirrored the one they had just weathered inside. Freedom was just a few feet away, but it felt like miles. Avery lowered Kaido gently onto a cold metal bench. His eyes were closed, his face a pale, sweat-sheened mask of pain. The dark stain on his side had spread, a grim map of his body's betrayal. She knew he needed a doctor, a real surgeon, not just a nurse with stolen sutures and a stolen life. Time was up. She looked out the window again. The perimeter was focused on the front. The back of the hospital, this quiet exit for the dead, was likely less guarded, but it wouldn't be for long. As if on cue, a long black sedan with tinted windows pulled into the alleyway opposite the loading bay, its headlights off. It sat there, a silent, waiting shadow in the downpour. His people. Loyal. Punctual. The separation was upon them, as sudden and jarring as their meeting. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the chase began to recede, leaving behind a hollow ache. The urgency of survival was being replaced by the complicated gravity of what had passed between them. She was a nurse who knew a Mafia code. He was a crime lord who had put his life in her hands. The rules of their respective worlds had been broken, and there was no going back. Kaido's eyes fluttered open. He seemed to sense the shift, the imminent departure. He reached up and caught her hand, his fingers cold but his grip firm. "They will look for you now," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. A terrible, unchangeable truth. "Because of me. You are marked, I know," she said quietly. She had known it from the moment she whispered the code. She had crossed a line, stepped out of the quiet life she had built for herself and back into the shadows. He struggled to sit up, fumbling at his right hand. He worked a ring off his pinky finger. It was a simple, heavy band of platinum, engraved with a single, stylized character, a symbol she recognized. The mark of the family. He pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers around it. The metal was warm from his skin. "This will not keep you safe," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, demanding she understand. "But it will identify you. To my people. It is a covenant. Show it to them. They will know what it means." The car outside flashed its headlights once.
It was time.
One of his men, the stone-faced guard from the hallway, got out and opened the back door, holding a black umbrella against the deluge. Avery helped Kaido to his feet. He leaned on her one last time as they walked the final few steps to the door. At the threshold, with the cold, wet air washing over them, he stopped and turned to face her fully. He was no longer just a patient. His authority, though physically diminished, was beginning to reassert itself. "Avery Thorne," he said, speaking her full name for the first time. It sounded like both a vow and a warning. "I will find you," he didn't say when. He didn't say why. But it was a promise. He released her, turned, and walked into the rain, his guard sheltering him as he climbed into the back of the waiting car. The door closed, and the sedan pulled away, its taillights bleeding red into the wet blackness before disappearing down the alley. Avery stood there, the cold rain misting her face, her hand clenched tightly around the platinum ring. She stood in the doorway for a long time, the rain-soaked wind chilling her to the bone. The alley was empty again, washed clean by the storm, as if the black sedan had been a hallucination. The flashing lights from the front of the hospital seemed a world away, a problem belonging to someone else. Eventually, the cold seeped in deep enough to break her trance. She stepped back inside, letting the heavy door click shut, the sound final and absolute. The sterile silence of the morgue enveloped her once more. She was alone. She looked down at her hand and slowly uncurled her fingers. The platinum ring sat heavy and foreign in her palm. The engraved character seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a brand marking her as part of a world she had fought so hard to escape. It was a promise of protection and a guarantee of danger all in one. She had saved a man's life, and in doing so, she had possibly forfeited her own. Her quiet life, the carefully constructed anonymity of Nurse Thorne, had been shattered. She was no longer just a face in a busy hospital, a competent professional fading into the background. She was the woman who knew the code. The woman who had spirited the head of the Kageyama Kai out from under the noses of professional cleaners. She was a loose end, a liability, and a mystery. Walking back through the deserted hospital was a surreal experience. The chaos in the ER had subsided, replaced by the grim efficiency of a police investigation. She saw officers interviewing a flustered Dr. Mills, their faces stern. She saw the two men in gray suits speaking quietly with a police detective, their expressions cold and controlled. No one paid her any attention. She was just a nurse in soiled green scrubs, walking away from a mess, another anonymous part of the scenery. She slipped into a staff locker room, stripped off the scrubs that smelled of antiseptic and Kaido's blood, and stuffed them deep into a biohazard bag. She showered, letting the scalding hot water wash away the grime and the chill, but it couldn't touch the cold that had settled deep inside her. Dressed in her street clothes, jeans and a simple gray sweater, she was anonymous again. But she felt exposed, as if the ring in her pocket were glowing through the fabric. She clocked out, nodding to the night supervisor, her face a mask of weary professionalism. No one questioned her. No one knew that she had just dismantled her entire existence in the space of a few hours. Her small apartment was a sanctuary of quiet normalcy. Rain pattered against the window pane, a soothing, familiar rhythm. She stood in the center of the living room, the darkness broken only by the ambient glow of the city outside. She took the ring out of her pocket, holding it up to the faint light. A covenant, a promise. He would find her. Was it a threat or a pledge? With a man like Kaido, it was probably both. The open loop of her life stretched before her, a dark and uncertain road. The skills she had buried, the instincts she had suppressed, the past she had run from, it was all bubbling back to the surface. She had been so careful, so disciplined, for so long. But tonight, a wounded man with the eyes of a cornered wolf had dragged her back into the storm. She walked to the window and looked down at the rain-slicked street below. The city lights blurred into a watercolor painting of amber and crimson. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, the ring digging into her skin. In her reflection, she saw her own eyes looking back, and they were not the tired, gentle eyes of a nurse. They were the eyes of someone who knew how to survive in the dark. The eyes of the person she used to be. the person she would have to become again. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, but Avery knew some stains never come out.